We're very lucky today that we have with us Professor Robert Pahre from the Department of Political Science at the University of Illinois. And he is, among other things, he's an expert on national parks, and especially national parks in the west of the United States. So, Professor Pahre, could you tell us about the work that you've done out west, and then we're going to bring it back to Cahokia in the state of Illinois.
Well, one of the large bodies of my research has been environmental issues around things like wildlife and threats to parks from outside their boundaries in places like Yellowstone National Park or elsewhere in the Rockies or out west. So very much a part of environmental politics. But a second line of research, which is relevant for Cahokia, is my current project, which is a book I'm working on called Telling America's Stories. And I'm looking at the politics behind what shows up in national park visitor centers. So if you go to a visitor center, or if you get the brochure, or you go to the website, there's obviously a bunch of material there. You can probably find a movie somewhere. And all of that put together is called interpretation. And it turns out that there are political factors behind that interpretation. Some of those examples are pretty famous examples. For example, Little Bighorn Battlefield is famous as a site where people have argued politically over how to tell the story of General Custer and of the Native Americans who defeated him that day. And it used to be purely a Custer story, and now it's a more balanced story. It's not a 50-50 balanced story, but it's certainly more balanced. And so that's a good example of the kind of politics behind this interpretation that I'm interested in.
And I think that that's very interesting because we have quite a few important sites in the United States that pertain to our Aboriginal or Indigenous or Native American people. And in the case of Cahokia Mounds, which are located right outside the city of Collinsville, which is in the Metro East area, on whose west side is St. Louis, we have what was the greatest archaeological site of North America, located north of Mexico City. This was a huge metropolis. And ironically, it has these very important designations of being not just a state historic site, not just a national historic landmark. It is a World Heritage Site, a UNESCO designated site for which there were fewer than 1,200 in the world. And yet it has not been a unit in the National Park Service. And around 2014, as you can see from this article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which I say parenthetically is interesting too, that it's St. Louis across the river that's advertising and involved with this site of Illinois that potentially could be a huge tourist attraction. There was this movement to get it to become part of the National Park Service. And then this past year, 2019, you can see by these headlines that there's really this increasing momentum for it to become a national park. It's now 2020. There's more conversation. So the reason why I wanted to speak with you and record you is you have so much experience with our national parks. What do you think will happen to this site, at this site? What's the importance for American people, for the site? What does it mean to become a unit of the National Park Service, bearing in mind, as you were saying, that there's also the issue of what story is going to be told, and at what point do we close the story for this site that was abandoned long before the Europeans arrived, but when they did, they saw it.
Yeah, and there's a lot to talk about in all that. Let me just talk for a little bit about what would happen if it became a national park unit. It's probably something like a National Historic Site. There's a couple dozen different labels, and so a National Historic Site would be a natural kind of label, and it is what it sounds like. It's still a national park, and so it's still the same rangers that you think of as being in, you know, a place like Yellowstone or Yosemite or the Grand Canyon. It's just a historic site as opposed to a nature-oriented site. And these sites, there's a number of criteria. Ultimately, Congress decides what should be a site in the system, and the National Park Service has official criteria. It wants a site to be significant in itself in some way for history or for archaeology, or a really good illustration of something, some trend, some period, some events. Clearly, Cahokia is outstanding in all those ways and was recognized as outstanding at the global level as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So really all you would have to do is take the application for the World Heritage Site and find the arguments there, and anything that makes the case for how this is globally important would certainly explain why it's nationally important. So that's a pretty straightforward case if you have the political will to do it, and if you have people in Congress who want to do it. Congress working the way that it works, you'd probably have to have not just the support of the Illinois delegation because it's in Illinois, but you'd also have to have some support from the Missouri delegation. Not all of Missouri, but certainly the St. Louis members of Congress should probably be there and be involved. And this is what happens when you change the classification of system of parks too. So Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore recently became Indiana Dunes National Park, and it had unanimous support from the congressional delegation, both Democrats and Republicans in Indiana, and it's in Chicagoland, and it had strong support from Chicago. And so that would be the political goal that you'd want for the legislation to get it passed. You'd have another option there, since the St. Louis Arch is part of what is now called Gateway National Park, a new unit. So the Arch, the parks around the Arch, the historic waterfront, the old courthouse, and the old church, old cathedral, are all part of that. And so that's a bunch of different kinds of sites. And so you could also have Cahokia be affiliated with that. In that case, you'd certainly have to have everybody in Missouri on board too. So you could either have it as standalone.
Yeah, because my archaeology colleagues who have worked at Cahokia and on the problem of Mississippian civilization say that this amazing site that we see in Illinois actually also existed on the Missouri side of the river. It's just that there's virtually nothing left. But yeah, it makes sense.
That's politically awkward.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes these things can be straddled in some ways, or you just make it a National Historic Site.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing that would mean is that instead of being an Illinois state park, which Illinois would have to pay for, or does pay for, and has to staff, and we all know that the Illinois state budget is not the healthiest budget in the country. And so you'd have the benefit of a national budget and being on the National Park Service. Sometimes these sites are obscure and out of the way, and they're not politically interesting when Congress allocates funds to park units. This one's in a major metropolitan area, so I actually think politically it would probably do pretty well. And it does okay in Illinois state politics, but the fact that it's in a metro area that's centered in Missouri probably doesn't help it politically. It's not in Chicago, and it's not in Springfield. So it would probably do better in budget terms. In terms of staff and expertise, so the Park Service has people on site at each of the parks, and then there are regional offices. And the regional offices provide a lot of administrative support these days. And they'll often have some kind of expertise at that level centralized This would be part of the Midwestern region, presumably. And so you might have region-wide historians or region-wide archaeologists who could help the site. So they wouldn't, I don't know how many staff they'd put there full-time, but they'd certainly be able to draw on people with regional expertise. And the National Park Service also has some specialized units to provide particular functions. So if you're building a new visitor center, you're building roads, you're just changing the landscape, that's all done in Denver. If you're doing interpretation, the brochures, the websites, that's done in Harpers Ferry, which is at the confluence of Maryland, Virginia, and West Virginia. So it's a politically attractive site because you get jobs in 3 states. Congress likes that. So that work would probably be done in Harpers Ferry. So you'd be drawing on people with expertise.
And it would be advertised because it would then appear in the literature and the maps and the passport that the National Park Service produces. So certainly there are people who visit Cahokia, but if it were part of the national park system, it would get, or do you think, but do you think it would get more attention? It seems that the UNESCO designation is meaningless to most people. They don't even know that it exists, but Americans love national parks, even regardless of whether they're Democrats or Republicans. We like national parks of any kind.
National Park Service is America's most popular agency. And so people do love them. Yeah, I mean, I have a friend who lives in the Chicago area, broadly defined, and he has visited all of the national parks at least once. In fact, he once visited all of them within a single year, which was a pretty crazy experience. So yeah, and he's one of a very small number who have visited them all in a single year, but there's a larger number of people who visited all of them. And the first effect, of course, is that all of those people would show up. So he'd drive down from Chicago and he'd visit Cahokia because he needs to tag that in order to keep visiting all the national parks. So there's people like that, and then it would be more visible. Depending on the location and how much interest there is and how well people know these sites already, you can get a doubling in visitation the first year just as people show up and say, wow, that's a national park. And if it has the label National Historic Site, that effect's probably a little smaller, but it's still a significant effect. You're going to have people. Certainly, it's going to get a lot of publicity in the St. Louis area. So you get a lot of more people there. I don't know to what extent they get visits from K through 12 students. I assume it's big. Probably would become even bigger with the national park designation. So you get all those folks.
Do you think that there are any controversies that would happen with a national park designation, either, I don't know, politically in terms of do they need to build, I'm looking at the top left and you can see a car going across the road that years ago was put through across the site. But could there be those kind of issues? But actually what I'm thinking about is I look at the middle image, which is of the really beautiful interpretive center. I wonder if you think, based on your experience with the Western forts, even though this is pre-European, but we do have the issue of the Indian population that made this site then dispersed and they became part of the Illinois population that then was expelled from the state of Illinois as the Anglo settlers came in. Do you think that this possible need, or at least I think of it as a need, not to truncate the story of Cahokia with its collapse before the Europeans, but how do you think the National Park Service deals with these kinds of tensions between our Native American people and those of European descent, let alone our African American population descended from slaves.
So let me just real quick mention the physical facility, because that I think is pretty easy right now. The Cahokia Visitor Center is in good shape, at least what you can see as a visitor. I have no idea how the plumbing or electrical system is.
No, it looks good.
But in terms of how it looks, it's actually good. The state of Illinois has done a good job, and it looks like it'll be around for a while. So that's all good. Because of course, spending money is always a political issue, and the political issue of does Illinois want to give up a UNESCO World Heritage Site as a in a state park? It would have to donate the land to the federal government, which lots of states do. It would save money because it wouldn't have to maintain it anymore. But that's how that conversation would go politically in the Illinois delegation and in Springfield and Chicago among our political leaders. The second thing, so my book, Telling America's Stories, covers about 50 of the national park units out of the total 420. Essentially everybody from the Mississippi to where the Rockies start. And it's a little hard to define where the Rockies start, so it's a little expansive on that end. And there's a lot of sites that tell or could tell Native American stories. And the first thing that shapes interpretation is really when a park is created and what's going on then. It's different if a park is created in the 1890s than the 1930s or the 1960s or now. So those things matter rather a lot. And also, who are the local stakeholders? Usually you have a local group that's pushing for a park. And in a couple of cases, the local group pushing for a park has been a tribe. So Grand Portage National Monument, which is at the western tip of Lake Superior and was a globally important portage. It's how furs got from the North American interior into the Great Lakes and then got shipped out to Europe. That was actually the Grand Portage Band of Chippewa Indians who wanted that to attract tourism. Nez Perce National Historic Park, which is it's in Spalding, Idaho, on the Clearwater River. The main advocate for making that a national park unit was, in fact, the Nez Perce tribe. There's a state park that's part of that now, and that has a slightly different history. But and so there's a few that are actually on reservations. Some are quite close to reservations. Knife River Indian Villages is just across the Missouri River from Fort Berthold and the three affiliated tribes, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikari. That's a Lewis and Clark site because it's where Lewis and Clark spent the first winter. But because of the close tribal ties, it actually doesn't tell Lewis and Clark all that much. I mean, it does mention that Lewis and Clark was there. It's where Lewis and Clark met Sacagawea, and and so where that part of the story started. But that is not the main story that they tell there. So I'd say the biggest thing is if you have a close geographical connection to indigenous peoples who are stakeholders and can tell you the story and draw on their elders and draw on their oral histories and draw on their own culture and language to whatever extent they still have it, that's going to be a big feature in the interpretation of a site. And as you mentioned, we've got a problem because the people here aren't here at Cahokia. And it's my understanding that the Cahokia trade network was quite huge. And includes people like the Muskogee who have some presence still in various places. So you still do have people that you could connect with, but they're not right there in East St. Louis. So the first thing that the Park Service should do and probably will want to do is start to build affiliations. So find out who the affiliated nations are, find out to what extent they have traditions or traditional knowledge about the place, what's the nature of their cultural affiliations, do they have any stories of their people having lived here, or is it just stories of their people having traded there? and to try to build up those sorts of things, because that will really make a difference in whether this is a purely archaeological site that talks about people who were here and are now gone. And of course, some sites are like that, right? Or whether this is a site that's where the story starts archaeologically. This is a story of people who were here and aren't here anymore, but they're still around and they're elsewhere. And there are still memories and stories and traditions and cultural affiliations, and it's still important for people who are still around.
And I think that's so important to dismiss the notion of the vanished race that became so popular at the end of the 19th century, when the United States was very successful in taking over all remaining Native American lands, but Native American people have not disappeared.
Not at all. And the trick here is that the particular tribal affiliations is not as clear cut as you would like, right, as like Grand Portage, which is on the reservation. There's a memorandum of understanding between the park and the tribe about things like tribal employment, purchasing local goods. They have partnerships, and there's bumps in the partnerships. Of course, there's always bumps in partnerships. It's in a good place now, as I understand it, in the scheme of things, and that's true in Nez Perce, and that's true in other places too.
And the Hopi have a tribal preservation office that works with Chaco Canyon, yes, even though that's an archaeological site abandoned long ago, but there the descendants have, my understanding is they've remained very much in place, and it's still a significant place to them. I think that there are tribal powwows that are held at Cahokia. So my understanding is there still is a sentiment and some kind of oral history legacy of a connection.
Yeah, and every tribe has a tribal historic preservation officer, just like states have state historic preservation officers. And they have the same rights and responsibilities under federal law as the state historic preservation officers. So the challenge there is just really small tribes don't have the money and staff, so they have basically a member who's an enthusiast for tribal history who serves that role. And then the big ones have offices with multiple people working in the office. One of the things I'm working on with my environmental hat on is tribal involvement in environmental issues around Yellowstone. And one of the national forests just completed a forest plan, and the Crow Nation's Tribal Historic Preservation Office wrote a letter about what its concerns were about the draft plan. And it was signed by 3 people plus the president of the tribal council. So they have at least 3 people working full-time in their tribal historic preservation officers. So they're relatively well staffed in the scheme of things.
I think it'll be very interesting then to see if Cahokia Mounds is successful politically, so as to become a unit of the National Park Service, and then to see especially what changes in the narrative that could happen within the interpretive center. And we can hope that this will benefit both tribal people as well as citizens, so that they better understand their country and its history, and also that hopefully it will bring more economic development, some degree of increase due to tourism numbers that I think we can expect would increase with this designation.
Yep, and a lot of them I assume will be day trippers from St. Louis, but there is a nice cluster of hotels and restaurants on the interstate. I think only 5 or 10 miles away. It's pretty right. Close. Just
right, and the hope that I have, I think, being chauvinistic as a resident of the state of Illinois, is I would really like to see more attention paid by the state of Illinois, so that the news is not solely coming from St. Louis, because as accessible as the site is going across the river from St. Louis, it is accessible from the Metro East area
Yes.
of Illinois. So hopefully this, if it becomes a unit, that there will be benefits for the state as well, and certainly increase in educational accessibility.
Yeah, it's a long day trip for us in East Central Illinois, but if you're in Chicago, I think it's an overnight. And so
Yeah,
I think
and that's good.
and that's good. I think
That's exactly what you want for tourism, is the overnight
right.
stay.
And then people would combine it with the arch.
Right. And hopefully for
And,
us,
they'd have reasons to come down and maybe, go see a baseball game, make it a 3-day weekend.
and in addition to baseball, it's the St. Louis Cardinals, right? Is that the team?
Yes.
St. Louis, thank goodness, since we're recording this. But what I would hope too, in terms of this project that we call the Mythic Mississippi, is that if we can get people to Cahokia, then hopefully we can encourage tourists to visit so many other interesting historic places in Illinois, both up and down the Mississippi River, as well as inland, and obviously Springfield because of the Abraham Lincoln connection. But there are many places in Illinois. It's a very interesting state, a fascinating history, really interesting archaeologically, and without a doubt, Cahokia is the showpiece. So thank you very much, Professor Pahre, for speaking with us, and I look forward to seeing you at school.
That sounds great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I've stopped recording. Everyone's going to hear